Ever feel like, the world's just changing so fast it's hard to keep up?
Oh, yeah.
Well, just try to imagine what it was like way back in the 16th and 17th centuries. You've got empires expanding, explorers are sailing off to who knows where. And even like the very idea of what people believed in, their faith, even that was getting completely shaken up.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're going to be looking at today in our deep dive into this era.
Sounds good.
So we're using all kinds of historical texts and images to like uncover what it was really like to live through these huge changes.
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes we forget how those changes really impacted individual people.
Totally. So, you might be thinking, why this particular period, right? But it's more than just, like memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's like, think about it this way. We're going to unpack like the very beginnings of globalization. Revolutions in thought, and sometimes, the not so great consequences of ambition.
Absolutely. And one of the most fascinating things about this period is that it wasn't just about like physical exploration.
Right.
The Columbian Exchange, which is what we call this period, right? It wasn't just about, we're trading some goods, between Europe and the Americas.
Right.
It was like this massive transfer of ideas, diseases, even religious practices. Is like someone just like hit the fast forward button on history and everything's just changing so rapidly.
Okay, so let's like set the stage a little bit.
Yeah.
I think when a lot of people hear about this era, they immediately think Columbus, right?
Oh, for sure.
But there's so much more to the story. Even before we like crossed the Atlantic, Europe itself was like ready to explode with change.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that really sparked all this exploration was actually the rise of the Ottoman Empire.
Oh.
They had basically gained control over all those like traditional trade routes to the east.
Okay.
Which was a huge problem for Europeans.
I see.
They wanted those exotic spices, pepper, cloves, all that stuff.
Yeah, like what would we do without pepper today?
Right. Can you imagine not having pepper in your diet?
I mean, it's everywhere.
It was a big deal back then. These spices weren't just for flavor, they were status symbols. They helped preserve food. People even thought they had like medicinal properties.
Oh, wow.
So finding new routes to the east, it wasn't just about economics, it was a social necessity.
So this is where we see the Portuguese, especially under Henry the Navigator.
Right.
And they're pushing down the coast of Africa. And it wasn't just about conquering new lands. They were trying to like outmaneuver the Ottomans in this, global marketplace.
Exactly. It was like a global chess game.
Wow.
But they couldn't have done it without some serious advancements in technology.
That's true.
This era saw like a surge in new innovations.
Okay.
Think about new ship designs like the caravel, which could sail closer to the wind astrolabes for celestial navigation and improved cartography.
Yeah.
These innovations allowed explorers to go farther with more confidence than ever before.
It's amazing to think that like what we might consider like basic tools today were revolutionary back then.
Oh, yeah.
And it makes you wonder like what innovations from our time will be seen as those game changers centuries from now.
Right. It's fascinating to think about.
Yeah. But for now, let's shift our focus to the Americas.
Okay.
What was the reality of European arrival like for the people who were already living there?
Well, it's a complex story and often a very tragic one. The Spanish conquistadors, driven by gold and glory, I mean, they toppled empires like the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayans.
Yeah, you learn about those in school.
Right. But their most powerful weapon wasn't steel, it was disease.
Oh, wow.
Smallpox, measles, influenza, these were invisible invaders that decimated native populations.
Because they had no immunity.
Exactly. They had never encountered these diseases before. Imagine entire communities just wiped out their knowledge, their culture disappearing with them. It was a biological catastrophe unlike anything Europe had ever seen.
It's easy to think about history in terms of battles and conquests, the things you see in movies.
Yeah.
But the impact of disease is something we often overlook.
Right. It's a hidden killer.
It really highlights how interconnected the world was becoming, even if those connections brought devastating consequences. And out of this turbulent period, a new social order began to emerge.
Right.
The caste system.
Yes, the caste system, it was this intricate hierarchy based on racial mixing.
Okay.
It reflected the complex interactions between Native Americans, Europeans, and Africans who were brought over as slaves.
So it's like your place in society wasn't determined by like what you did, but by the color of your skin.
Exactly, and the perceived purity of your bloodline.
Wow.
It created this rigid social structure with huge implications for people's lives, their opportunities, even their identities.
So while all this exploration and conquest is reshaping the Americas, Europe itself isn't exactly sitting still.
Not at all.
This was a time of intense religious upheaval, a period we call the Protestant Reformation.
Right. While explorers were setting sail back in Europe, thinkers and theologians were challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. And to understand this, we need to look at the concept of indulgences.
Okay.
These were basically payments to the church that people believed would reduce their punishment for sins.
I see.
Many saw this practice as corrupt, exploitative, and it led to a lot of resentment and calls for reform.
Okay, so this is where Martin Luther enters the picture, right?
Exactly.
He was a German monk who in 1517 nailed his famous 95 Theses to a church door,
Right.
outlining all his critiques of the church.
It was a bold move.
It wasn't just a theological debate, though.
No, it was a revolution.
And it reshaped the religious and political landscape of Europe.
Completely.
Luther's ideas, they were like radical for the
Well,
time.
he emphasized salvation through faith alone.
Okay.
The sole authority of the Bible. And he challenged the power of the Pope and the whole church hierarchy.
Wow.
These ideas resonated with people who were disillusioned with the church.
I see.
They were seeking a more personal and direct connection with God.
So like the printing press is a huge part of this too, right?
Absolutely was a game changer.
This invention allowed Luther's ideas to spread like wildfire.
It was like the first social media platform almost.
Ah.
Pamphlets and writings flying across Europe, sparking debates and challenging traditional power structures.
So it didn't stop with Luther though, right?
Nope. Protestantism fragmented into all sorts of denominations,
Okay.
each with their own interpretations and practices.
Huh.
This led to a more diverse religious landscape, for sure,
That's good.
but also to conflict and tension as different groups vied for power and influence.
So we've got empires clashing explorers pushing the boundaries of the known world, and a religious revolution shaking the foundations of faith. It's almost hard to keep up with all the changes happening at once.
It was a truly transformative period.
But before we get into like the ramifications of the Protestant Reformation,
Okay.
let's take a closer look at some of the key figures who emerged from this really tumultuous period.
Sounds good. Oh, yeah. One of the most influential was John Calvin.
Okay.
He was a French theologian who developed a system of beliefs known as Calvinism,
Right.
and it emphasized this idea of predestination.
Predestination.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which basically meant that God had already chosen who would be saved and who wouldn't,
Wow.
regardless of their actions.
So like fate is already decided.
Exactly. It might sound kind of harsh, but it actually appealed to a lot of people, especially those in the rising middle class.
Okay, so why would something like that be appealing?
Well, think about it. It's almost like having a cosmic safety net, you know?
Okay.
If you're successful in life, it's a sign of God's favor.
I see.
It gave people a sense of security and purpose.
Interesting. But we can't talk about the Reformation without mentioning, one of the most colorful figures in history,
Oh, yeah.
King Henry VIII of England.
Oh, absolutely. Henry's break from the Catholic Church was a major turning point in English history.
And it wasn't for religious reasons like Luther, right?
No, not really. It was driven by something way more personal.
Okay.
His desire for a male heir and his inability to get a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon.
Right.
So he basically created his own church.
What?
Yeah, the Church of England with himself as the head,
Wow.
just so he could annul his marriage.
It's amazing how personal desires can sometimes have these huge historical consequences.
Oh, for sure. Talk about a power move, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
But of course, the Catholic Church wasn't just going to like sit back and watch this happen.
No, they weren't. They launched what we call the Counter-Reformation.
Okay.
They doubled down on their doctrines, cracked down on dissent, and even created new religious orders like the Jesuits.
The Jesuits.
Yeah, they were known for their education and missionary work. It was a battle for the hearts and minds of Europe.
So with all this religious turmoil going on, things got pretty heated right now.
Unfortunately, yes, Europe became a battleground for religious wars.
Oh, well.
The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 tried to bring some stability, by allowing each ruler to choose the religion of their territory.
Okay.
But it was a fragile peace.
Right.
The Spanish Armada's attempt to conquer England in 1588.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
That's a prime example of how high the stakes were.
Like those huge Spanish warships sailing towards England.
Exactly. Aiming to depose Queen Elizabeth I, who was a Protestant, and restore Catholicism.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
But speaking of high stakes, while all this is happening in Europe, there's another story unfolding, a much darker chapter in human history.
Right.
The transatlantic slave trade.
This is a tough topic to talk about.
Yeah.
But it's so important to understand its impact.
For sure.
The demand for labor in the Americas, especially on those brutal sugar plantations, fueled this horrific trade in human beings.
Right.
European powers, the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, French, they were all involved.
Wow.
Millions of Africans were taken from their homes, transported across the Atlantic in just terrible conditions.
That's hard to even imagine.
And then forced into a life of labor.
It's really a stain on human history.
It is.
It's hard to fathom the scale of suffering involved.
It's almost unimaginable.
Especially when you consider that this was happening at the same time as all this exploration and innovation and religious reform. It makes you question the progress that was supposedly being made.
It's a stark reminder that history is full of contradictions.
Yeah.
While some were pushing the boundaries of knowledge and fighting for religious freedom,
Right.
others were profiting from the enslavement of millions.
And the impact of the transatlantic slave trade is still felt today.
Absolutely, in racial inequalities, economic disparities, and social injustices.
As a legacy that continues to haunt us.
It does.
But it's also important to remember that African societies weren't just passive victims in this story.
Right.
Some kingdoms like Oyo and Benin, they actually grew in power because of their involvement in the slave trade.
Exactly. Often at the expense of their neighbors.
Which raises some really complex moral questions.
It does. It challenges us to think about the different ways that people navigated this brutal system.
Right.
The difficult choices they had to make.
It's a reminder that history is not black and white.
Not at all. It's full of shades of gray.
It's easy to judge the past,
Yeah.
from our modern perspective.
Oh, yeah. Hindsight is 20/20. Right.
But it's important to try to understand the complexities of the time.
For sure.
And one of the fascinating, albeit tragic outcomes of the slave trade was the emergence of unique cultural and religious practices.
Absolutely. Despite the horrors they endured enslaved a bit, Africans found ways to preserve their heritage and create new forms of expression.
Okay.
They brought their religions, their music, their traditions with them. And those traditions blended with European and indigenous cultures to create something new and vibrant.
Wow.
Think about syncretic faiths like Santeria in Cuba and Candomblé in Brazil.
Okay.
These faiths combined elements of African religions with Catholicism.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
Yeah. It is.
Ability to find meaning and hope, even in the face of unimaginable hardship.
Absolutely. And those cultural fusions continue to enrich our world today.
That's amazing.
It is. But as we reflect on this period of just immense change, it's important to remember that history isn't just about these grand narratives and sweeping events.
Right.
It's about individual lives, choices, and experiences.
That's what makes history so compelling, right?
It is. It's ultimately about people. Their dreams, their struggles, their triumphs, and their failures.
Wow. It's almost overwhelming. To think about all the changes we've talked about.
Yeah.
Exploration, religious upheaval, empires, rising and falling, and then the horrific reality of the slave trade. It's a lot to process.
It is, and what's even more fascinating is how these events that seem so distant, they still shape our world today.
That's true.
I mean, think about it. The religious divisions from the Reformation, they're still influencing political and social debates.
Right.
And the legacies of colonialism and the slave trade, they're woven into our economies, our cultures, and sadly, even our prejudices.
It's true.
And those seeds of globalization that were planted back then, they've grown into this interconnected world we live in today.
It really makes you realize that history isn't just something you read in a textbook.
Right.
It's like the foundation of our present.
It is.
And understanding, this interconnectedness, it can help us navigate the complexities of our own time.
Absolutely.
We can see the echoes of the past in our current events.
Yeah.
And maybe that helps us make sense of them a little better.
Exactly. It's like having a deeper understanding of the characters in a play.
Okay.
After you've read the first few acts, their motivations, their relationships, their flaws.
Right.
It all makes more sense.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this pivotal period, what's something you think our listener should explore further on their own?
I think it would be fascinating to delve deeper into the lives of individuals who lived through this time.
Okay.
Not just the kings and queens, the explorers, the reformers.
Right.
But what was it like to be a peasant farmer in Germany during the Reformation, or an indigenous woman in the Andes witnessing the arrival of the Spanish?
That's a good point.
History becomes so much more real and relatable when we connect with those human stories.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles.
No.
It's about people just like us trying to make sense of their world just like we are today.
Exactly.
So maybe our listener could pick a figure who intrigues them
Right.
and dive into their biography. Someone like Martin Luther, whose defiance, sparked a religious revolution.
Right.
Or Henry VIII, whose quest for a male heir changed the course of English history.
Yeah.
Or even Queen Nzinga, who fiercely resisted Portuguese expansion in Africa.
Oh, wow.
Their stories offer a window into the past, and they can teach us so much about resilience, ambition, and the complexities of human nature.
Absolutely.
And let's not forget about the everyday aspects of life during this time.
Right.
How did people eat? What did they wear? What were their beliefs and values?
Those details are important.
Exploring those details can really bring the past to life.
It can. And don't underestimate the power of primary sources.
Oh, yeah.
Letters, diaries, even recipes can offer incredible insights into how people lived, thought, and felt.
So it's like stepping back in time.
It is.
So as we conclude this deep dive, we encourage you, our listener, to keep exploring this fascinating period.
Yeah.
Don't just think of it as dates and battles, but as a tapestry woven from countless individual lives and choices that shaped the course of history. And who knows? You might even discover unexpected connections to your own life and the world we live in today.
The beauty of history is that it's always open to interpretation, to new discoveries, to fresh perspectives.
That's a good point.
So keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and keep making those connections between the past and the present.
Great advice. And join us next time for another deep dive into a fascinating corner of history.
I'll be here.
Until then, keep those minds curious.